Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, sat down for a 3-hour interview discussing a wide range of topics, from his admiration for President Trump to the corruption in Brazil. He spoke about the challenges he faced in his country, including the politicized Supreme Court, which he believes worked against him in the last election. Bolsonaro also discussed the similarities between his situation and that of President Trump, noting that both of them were seen as outsiders and faced intense opposition from the establishment. He expressed his gratitude for the opportunity to share his thoughts and feelings with the world. Speaking about the intense politics in Brazil and the challenges he faced as a president, Bolsonaro noted that he and Trump had a great relationship, despite some disagreements on issues like trade. He praised Trump's efforts to strengthen the democratic world and his support for Brazil's potential. The conversation also touched on the topic of corruption in Brazil, with Bolsonaro discussing the challenges faced by small business owners and the difficulties in paying taxes. He emphasized the need for transparency and accountability in the government and the importance of protecting the rights of citizens. Bolsonaro also spoke about his own experiences, including being stabbed and facing opposition from the establishment. He expressed his admiration for President Trump's strength and resilience in the face of adversity. He also discussed the similarities between their situations, noting that both of them were seen as outsiders and faced intense opposition from the establishment. Bolsonaro couldn't show videos of Lula being in favor of abortion or sympathetic to cell phone thieves. Instead, he was accused of being xenophobic, homicidal, and a pedophile. He was even accused of trying to kill a city councilwoman in Rio, but it was later discovered that the killer was someone else who lived in his condominium. Bolsonaro was also accused of harassing a whale in Brazil and receiving a gift from Saudi Arabia. The Supreme Court in Brazil is incredibly powerful, with the ability to sentence people to prison even if they are congressmen. Bolsonaro granted amnesty to a congressman who was sentenced to almost 9 years in prison, but the Supreme Federal Court overturned the amnesty. Bolsonaro believes that the Supreme Court is above good and evil.
Patrick David pointed out that the Supreme Court in Brazil is dominated by left-leaning justices, with many of them appointed by Dilma and Lula.
Bolsonaro's strategy to fight against the Supreme Court is to increase the number of ministers and have a strong Senate that can show the court that it is not above the law. He also wants to give 50% of the representatives and 50% of the senators to the Conservative Party in the next election. Bolsonaro believes that the Supreme Court will try to make him ineligible, but he has other plans to reach the presidency. He thinks that his wife, who is a discreet person and a Christian, could beat Lula in an election. Bolsonaro also pointed out that a recent poll showed him 5 points ahead of Lula.
Patrick David noted that Bolsonaro has a bigger challenge to overcome than President Trump did in the US, as the Supreme Court, Senate, and House in Brazil are all against him.
Bolsonaro's strategy is to rely on the popular force, as he believes that the people are suffering due to economic mistakes made by Lula. He traveled to almost 200 cities in Brazil last year and received a fantastic reception. Bolsonaro also pointed out that the most important force in Brazil is not the parliament, the presidency, or the Supreme Federal Court, but the popular force. He believes that he can overcome the obstacles ahead, just like he did in the past when he was elected president with less than $1 million. Bolsonaro hopes that the world will recognize the elections in Brazil, just like Trump did in the US.
Patrick David asked Bolsonaro how he plans to apply the lessons he learned from Trump's campaign in the US to his own campaign in Brazil.
Bolsonaro noted that the American judicial system is different from Brazil's, as it doesn't have political involvement in decision. He also pointed out that Trump has been able to donate openly to the party, which is forbidden in Brazil. Bolsonaro's proposal is to take into account the differences between the two countries and find a way to overcome the obstacles ahead. He points out that the Christian audience, which makes up 1/3 of the Brazilian population, largely supports him. Additionally, many sectors of society, such as agribusiness, which accounts for 1/3 of Brazil's GDP, are also behind him. Bolsonaro notes that his travels around Brazil have shown him that many people, including those in the armed forces and security forces, are on his side. Bolsonaro mentions that his minister, Tarcísio de Freitas, who was elected governor of São Paulo, is doing well in his role. He also highlights the success of other candidates he has supported, such as Nicolas Ferreira, Gustavo Guilherme, and Eduardo Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro believes that his campaign in the upcoming year will be stronger than his previous ones, and he is convinced that something happened in the past that needs to be investigated. Bolsonaro expresses his desire to free Brazil from what he sees as a dictatorship and to solve the country's problems. He believes that the Lula government wants to censor social media and restrict freedom of speech. He also thinks that the Superior Electoral Court is biased against him and that the press is afraid to ask for an investigation into the ballot boxes.
Patrick David brings up a comment made by Mike Pence, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary, who claims that USAID has been involved in undermining populist movements around the world, including in Brazil.
Bolsonaro says he trusts Mike Pence and believes that USAID's actions may have contributed to his loss in the election. He notes that the Superior Electoral Court gathered a large number of influencers to work against him, and that the court's campaign to get young people to register to vote resulted in over 4 million new voters, many of whom supported Lula. Bolsonaro believes that if it were not for USAID's involvement, he would have won the election. He thinks that the Biden administration helped Lula get elected, and that Lula's victory was not legitimate. Bolsonaro also believes that the Clean Record Act, which prohibits people with convictions from running in elections, was ignored in Lula's case.
Patrick David asks Bolsonaro how Brazilians would react if it were discovered that the U.S. government had interfered in the election to ensure his loss.
Bolsonaro says that if this information became public, more people would support him, and he would have a stronger case to demand the annulment of the election. He believes that the American government should only recognize the election of a president who was elected in a clean, transparent, and auditable electoral system. Bolsonaro also expresses his desire for the American government to take action to help Brazil get out of its current situation, similar to what was done with Venezuela. He believes that President Trump would be interested in this information being public, because it would help to expose the deep state and the corruption that is affecting Brazil. Bolsonaro thinks that Trump's special assistant, Elon Musk, could help to uncover the truth and bring about positive change in Brazil. He points out that after World War II, the US could have gained control of a large part of the world, but chose not to. Bolsonaro praises Trump for understanding the importance of freedom of expression and democracy, and he believes that Trump's administration has been a positive influence on the world. Bolsonaro also discusses the game of war, a popular board game in Brazil, and how it illustrates the strategic importance of Brazil in South America. He notes that if Brazil falls to communism, it would be a disaster for the world, as it would lead to a massive influx of refugees. Bolsonaro expresses his gratitude for Trump's election win, which he believes has given Brazil hope. He also discusses the issue of uranium and how Lula, the current president of Brazil, has signed agreements with China that could compromise Brazil's sovereignty. Bolsonaro notes that China is buying up land in Brazil, and that this could lead to the exploitation of Brazil's natural resources. He also mentions that Trump has been a strong supporter of the U.S. military presence in Brazil, and that he believes an American military base in the Triple Frontier region would be a welcome development.
Patrick David asks Bolsonaro about the situation in Panama, where China was gaining control, and how Trump responded by threatening to withdraw his support.
Bolsonaro agrees that Trump was right to take a strong stance and notes that China's influence in Brazil is a major concern. He also discusses the issue of Brazilian citizens moving to China and how this could be a sign of China's growing influence in Brazil. Bolsonaro also talks about his own relationship with Trump and how they share a common goal of promoting democracy and freedom. He notes that Trump's administration has been supportive of Brazil's efforts to combat crime and corruption. Bolsonaro also discusses the issue of land ownership in Brazil and how China is buying up land, which could lead to the exploitation of Brazil's natural resources.
Patrick David asks Bolsonaro about the relationship between Lula and Xi Jinping, and Bolsonaro notes that Lula is subservient to China and that their relationship is a major concern for Brazil's sovereignty. He also discusses the issue of lithium extraction in Brazil and how China is gaining control of this valuable resource.
Bolsonaro notes that Trump has been a strong supporter of the US dollar and that Lula's proposal to switch to the Chinese yuan is a sign of his subservience to China. Bolsonaro also talks about the popularity of Lula and how his approval ratings have plummeted since taking office. He notes that Lula's policies have been disastrous for Brazil and that his administration is corrupt and incompetent. Bolsonaro also discusses the issue of Operation Car Wash and how it was used to bring down his government and install Lula as president. He notes that Lula's administration is a disaster and that Brazil is suffering as a result. The accused in plea bargains are always the same individuals who have admitted to their crimes in exchange for reduced sentences. These individuals have handed over billions of Brazilian reals, and the country's corruption is evident in the fact that a scoundrel like Lula da Silva can lie about barbecue and beer to win election. Lula has even been seen with drug dealers in Rio de Janeiro, and the country's Minister of Justice has entered a community in Rio de Janeiro to talk to local leaders who are elected among organized crime. The current state of Brazil is one of increasing desperation, with prices rising exponentially. The price of coffee, for example, is RS. RS, which doesn't make sense in an agricultural country like Brazil. The government has tried to cover up the inflation numbers, but people know what's happening. Jair Bolsonaro, the former president, has taken steps to reduce taxes and eliminate federal fuel taxes, which has led to an increase in tax collection. However, the current government is lying about the state of the economy, and the people are suffering as a result. The situation in Brazil is so dire that people are fleeing to Argentina as political refugees, fleeing from Alexandre Moraes, who has the power to arrest whoever he wants. There are even mothers with children who are imprisoned, and collectors who have been imprisoned for months. The government is using cowardice to condemn these people to absurd sentences, and Jair Bolsonaro himself is facing a sentence of 28 years in prison without any evidence. The most powerful individual in Brazil today is TV Globo, which influences the population and only cares about money. However, Jair Bolsonaro believes that Alexandre Moraes is the most rotten man in Brazil, with the ability to arrest whoever he wants for no reason. Moraes has been in charge of an investigation since the year of his death and has the power to negotiate plea bargains and conduct searches and seizures. Gilberto Kassab, the head of a party, is getting closer to Jair Bolsonaro, and they are talking about the issue of amnesty. Kassab has 3 ministries with Lula, but his deputies are already wanting to leave the government because they think it will be a disaster for them during the elections next year. Jair Bolsonaro believes that Kassab is not coming to him, nor is he coming to Kassab, but they are understanding each other and working together on issues like amnesty. Kassab is not afraid of Alexandre de Moraes, and Jair Bolsonaro believes that he is not the type of man who fears him. Kassab has already signaled his support for amnesty, and Jair Bolsonaro believes that he is getting closer to what Brazil needs to be. The politics in Brazil has always been about division between parties, but Jair Bolsonaro is trying to work with Kassab to achieve common goals. He claims that this region should be the best in Brazil, but is instead the worst, with high levels of unemployment, insecurity, and poor education. Bolsonaro believes that the government doesn't care about the lies it tells, using the example of the beef issue, and that the left has been telling the same lies since Lula's first election in 2002. Bolsonaro's Liberal Party is currently the largest party in the chamber, but the Social Democratic Party from Kassab holds the majority in the Senate. However, Bolsonaro is confident that his party will tie with Kassab in the Senate soon, and that many of Kassab's people vote for his proposal. He believes that his party has a strong base, with 95 federal deputies and approximately 140 deputies from other parties that support him. The conversation turns to the topic of hope, and how it's essential for the people of Brazil.
Patrick David shares a story about giving a shirt to Nicolas Ferreiro with the slogan "Future." Looks bright with Brazilian flag and encourages Bolsonaro to wear it as a symbol of hope.
Bolsonaro hasn't read the book Team of Rivals, but is interested in learning more about it. Bolsonaro is working with various influencers and politicians, including some from the left, to build alliances and create a coalition. He mentions that even people from the Supreme Court have spoken to him, and some major business people in Brazil have expressed support, although they asked for confidentiality to avoid retaliation. The discussion turns to the topic of taxes and the economy. Bolsonaro explains that the idea of exempting people from paying taxes under 5,000 reais was his idea, but he wants to see the compensatory source for the municipalities. Bolsonaro shares his vision for Brazil's economy, which includes deregulation, debureaucratization, reducing the tax burden, and energy shock. He mentions that he reduced taxes on various products, including fuel-related ones, and transformed the Brazilian government into the second most digital in the world. The conversation then turns to the challenges faced by business owners in Brazil, including high taxes, regulations, and labor rights. Bolsonaro explains that the salary is high for those who pay and low for those who receive, and that employers have to pay another 1,000 reais to the government for every 1,000 reais paid to the employer. He believes that the left mobilizes workers against employers who try to change labor rights, and that this has led to a complicated situation. Bolsonaro shares a project called My First Business that he shifted discussing with Paulo Guedes, which aims to give people the chance to open their own business and pay a good salary to their employees. However, he acknowledges that labor rights are included in the Brazilian constitution and cannot be removed. He believes that the situation is complicated and that discussing it can lead to losing elections due to the left's opposition. Business owners and taxes were a major concern, and the pension system was not working anymore. The number of social benefits was increasing, and it was difficult to find people to work. If a new pension reform wasn't done, Brazil would go bankrupt. The left had a huge ability to lie about the issue, and the Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes, had proposed creating a different work card to ease the burden on employers. But the left bombarded the idea, and it didn't move forward. The problem was that there were 22 million people in social programs like Bolsa Familia, and almost half of the states had more Bolsa Familia beneficiaries than people with a signed work card. The population didn't have the right information, and the public education system was overrun by people on the left who didn't let the truth be told.
Patrick David asked Jair Bolsonaro if he would consider lowering capital gains tax from 15% to 10% for small business owners.
Bolsonaro said that they had shifted reducing the tax burden in the third year of his administration, and it worked because they were able to collect more revenue. When the tax burden is too high, entrepreneurs own two choices: go bankrupt or evade taxes. Bolsonaro also talked about how he led by example, turning off the pool heater at the Alvarado Palace and never using his company card. He slept in army barracks when he traveled through Brazil and in embassies when he went abroad. He finished his term without any corruption allegations, but the police raided his house in Brasilia and took his weapons. The conversation turned to the difference between Brazil and Argentina.
Patrick David asked if there was someone like Alexandre de Moraes in Argentina who was not happy about Millet winning. Argentina shifted to succeed again, and the Argentine peso increased in value.
Bolsonaro also talked about how Brazil has a lot of potential, but they need to take measures to reduce the tax burden. If they don't, nobody will want to have a business in Brazil. The interest rate in Brazil is one of the highest in the world, and people prefer to invest in the stock market or keep their money in the bank.
Patrick David asked Bolsonaro about his campaign and how he plans to get the people behind him.
Bolsonaro said that the economy is a key issue, and he needs to stick to it. He also talked about to access the complete 34-minute summary and unlock detailed insights for each topic discussed in the video. Please subscribe to quick podcast summaries on Spotify and Apple Podcasts with free trial. And later, just for the price of candy in most places. Happy listening.